Aha, we're on. Mikael, welcome. Thank you very
Hi.
much. And thank you very much for spending 30 minutes of what I think is going to be a really interesting conversation. As I just mentioned, as we were prepping for this, I typically, when I'm thinking about PE and global perspectives of PE, I turn to good friend Dr. Ash Casey, and you were top of his list of people that I needed to connect with. So you got something to live up to there.
Thanks.
And I guess in prep for this call, did a little bit of reading around, but I'd obviously come across you previously as well, and really picked up on that keynote that you did up in Edinburgh, talking about putting the E, but also the P back into PE and making sure that it's educative and really present. And I guess right now, as we sit here in lockdown, as many schools are trying to figure out how they recover, how they pull things back together, how they put a curriculum back together, maybe a nice place to start would be sort of picking up, if people haven't seen that paper, what message are you trying to get across through that?
Well, that's I work with that. I mean, the result of that paper is 10 years of work, of course, and I spent, I think, 9 months of writing it. So it's a lot of things, but for me, it's about how do we put the E in PE in many senses without losing the P, because of course in a dualistic idea of theory and practice, we can lose the P if we move towards a theoretical understanding of what education is about. So what I try to do there is to, with a certain view of the child as a child that becomes something in a constant process of becoming something in an open-ended idea, and also a certain view of what education is, that it should be educative rather than miseducative, or I mean, you can learn things. Dewey talks about becoming a good thief when you're in prison is learning something, but it's not educative because it's not related to the goals of education and a democratic society in that sense. So for me, it's about different ways of how we can think about physical education without losing sight of the E or the P in that sense. And interesting, I'm from Sweden, and the word education doesn't exist in the name of the subject in Sweden. So it's called idrott och hälsa, which means, if you translate it right off, it's sports and health, even if the word idrott is a different word than sports in English. It involves much more things. It's a wider concept than sports.
Okay, that's really interesting, because, and we'll draw a bit more on your context of Sweden in a minute, but you touch again on something that for me in England has been a concern ever since the creation of examined PE and what I would call sports science rather than perhaps PE. That has become a priority focus because it's easy to measure, rather than perhaps being the root purpose of PE. And I think you mentioned similar. So what's your experience of that Swedish sport and health curriculum? What does it look like?
Well, and I come back to the grading and assessment part because that is complex in PE in many senses. But I would say that I mean, we have a national curriculum in Sweden. It's shifted over the years, of course. We had at the moment, if you look at, I mean, it's compulsory schooling up to year 9 when the kids are 15, and then it's upper secondary, and it's not compulsory, but most kids young people go to that. But it's voluntary in one sense. But if you look at the compulsory part, it's 3 basic areas. It's movement, it's health and lifestyle, and it's outdoor life and outdoor activities. So 3 basic areas, and the main purpose in physical education in Sweden would be something like, I wrote it down here, is that teaching physical education and health should aim at pupils develop all-round movement capacity and an interest in being physically active and spending time outdoors in nature. So it's about a lot around all-round movement, develop a complexity in movement. It's from basic movements like motor development, but also pace and rhythm in dance. They use gymnastics, games, swimming, and later on weight training and stuff like that, strength training. But it's always focused on movement rather than it's not the game in itself, it's not the sports in itself, not necessarily, but it's doing something with it. Of course, that's part of it. Håkan Larsson and I wrote a paper about this. It's called Same but Different. So it from a distance, it looks the same if you do sports. They play basketball, but the purpose is slightly different.
Yeah.
I would say the Swedish curriculum try to it's not competitive sports, and it's not techniques, but it's about creating an enjoyable game in a sense.
Okay.
With the problem that involves, of course. But I think it's different. From a distance, it looks the same, but if you come in close, you can see they do it for different purposes, and the students, some pick it up, some don't, but it's different ends in view in the activity.
So is that similar to in the UK? I would be quite critical. Well, in England, quite critical of departments in PE where they'd have their 6-week blocks of different sports. So from a distance, it looks like weeks of rugby, 6 weeks of football, weeks of dance, but it's nuanced. When I get closer to the detail, I can see that actually that is just a vehicle, that it's the wider learning in and through that's happening. But from what it looks like on a timetable, I can't see the substance of it.
No. And I mean, one of the problems in doing it like this, focusing on the enjoyment and the positive experiences and interpersonal skills is doing it through basketball or football or whatever games or gymnastics. It might be a watered down version. You're not sticking to something over time as much. So it's and I say you can do this well and not so well. It can be more focused on the doing than the learning. So it's quite open what to do, and it can be quite different in practice. But I think the intention is something different than trying to distance themselves to competitive ideas of sport. And I mean, when we interview kids in school, they talk about, I play basketball in my spare time, but this is in school. Then it's different. Then we all have to create something together. We have to cooperate. And most kids get that, but not all of them. It's conflicts in that, the relation between what happens in school and outdoors, which to a sense looks the same, but isn't the same.
Yeah. Okay. I quite often talk about PE as the Marmite subject in England. That some love it, some hate it. Is that fair to say? It'd be similar in Sweden, or?
Yeah, I would. When we have had questionnaires and stuff out, I mean, most kids in school think it's important. Most of them enjoy it, and then it's a group of 10-15% that left out, feel clumsy, hate it, and so forth. And that, of course, also is part of the problem of some stuff which I might want to change, because if 80% likes it as it is, why change? Should we wrote about this as a terror of enjoyment or terror of fun, because if everything should be fun, and you change something in order to include the young people that don't enjoy it in a different way, then might be 50% that don't enjoy what you're doing. So you're actually going against your own purpose a little bit, if it's about enjoyment and positive experience.
And I guess that's about having a number of different approaches, so that over the course of your program, you hit the needs, the motivations of those different groups.
Yeah, and that is, of course, the basic idea, and that is the hope the policy document is trying to convey.
Yeah. So 2 other questions you've just prompted me on there. The one you got me to shelve or put on ice, grading and assessment. So talk to me a little bit more about that for a second.
Yeah, and I think it's always been a debate around and we have different grading systems over the year. We had a curriculum between 94 and up to a couple of years ago that were not. It was the thinnest national curriculum in the world. It was just a couple of pages with ideas of PE, and then you should grade from that and create your own criteria. Then in the latest one from 2011, there were more clear grading criteria, and we have grading from year 6 when they are 12, 13. But some things are quite easy. Be able to swim 200 meters, very easy to grade in a sense. But otherwise, other things like you should grade complexity in movement, for example. What is complexity in this sense? Complex for whom, and in relation to what? And those discussions are all the time. And I think some teachers have gone towards, let's do things and then we grade and we do it mostly on the theoretical aspects. Or some have tried to find criteria and their own criteria for what is complexity, but it's not equal in a sense because they have different interpretations. And the difficulty, I think, several teachers we have interviewed says that the grading makes PE not as good as what I thought it would be, because I want to do this, but I have to grade. So that becomes problematic. For me as a researcher, grading and the focus on knowledge criteria has made a more focus on what should they learn in PE, not what they should do in PE. So I think the shift from 2011 has been more focused on knowledge, but the teachers have been left a little bit alone around how to handle that. I think how to handle the ideas of what embodied knowledge is.
Yeah. And I guess it's about what they can take from PE as well. That's what
isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And another thing before we go to the next one, which I hasten through, it's the outdoor life and activities, because that is really important in Sweden. We call it friluftsliv, and that is translated life in free air, which is not just being outdoors and it's not adventure education. It's a lot about, of course, it's basic skills like finding your way with a map and stuff like that, but it's also your rights and obligations when you're out in the nature. It's the cultural traditions of outdoor life. It's being outdoors in different seasons. It's just being in nature, cooking, enjoying positive experiences of nature and stuff like that. Not necessarily climbing a mountain or doing a obstacle course outdoors. So it's a Nordic tradition of, which sometimes is used also in English, friluftsliv, as a word.
Yeah, no,
and that is an important part of PE in Sweden.
Yeah, it's a huge bit, and I think the OAA, as you call it, is very undervalued in England, and sometimes due to context, it's very hard in some schools to be able to do that in a meaningful way. But from a personal perspective, the where I find space to think and pause for a moment, the outdoor spaces are ideal for that, whether that's surfing or skiing or riding a bike or just walking in the countryside. And I think the UK government have recognised that right now in lockdown, how important that is to our lives, and we've perhaps not played to the true strengths of that through the PE offer and what we give in schools. And the other bit that you prompted me to think about is you mentioned that first focus of compulsory PE being around movement, and it just made me think of Swedish gymnastics. We talk about that as the old tradition. So, I mean, Swedish gymnastics, where's that come from, and where is it at now?
I mean, I would say it's not there anymore in a sense. I mean, it's Per Henrik Ling and Ling gymnastics, which was built on a different idea. I mean, if you look historically in Sweden, it started as PEs was about Ling gymnastics. It was about doing it was an idea of posture, movement, all around movement competence. It was a wide movement competence that you should do for well-being and that kind of health. So it was a different idea. So in like 100 years ago, there was a debate or conflict between modern sports and Ling gymnastics, because you didn't compete in Ling gymnastic in a sense. So it was, and the modern sports tradition, in a sense, won PE, and it moved on. And I think Barbara Carley wrote a thesis around that, because Ling gymnastics stayed as long as we had separate PE for boys and girls. Some of the ideas from Ling gymnastics stayed longer in girls' PE, and also the PET education were different, men and women separate in that sense. But when they moved together, and from end of 70s, beginning of 80s, the norm was co-ed PE, then the norm was boys PE, was PE, and then it became more sports in a sense, more physiology, more sports, more physical training in that sense. So I think, but what is left is, of course, I mean, the formulation of the pupils should develop all around the movement capacity. It's about that idea of the whole body in a sense. I think that is something that has affected formulations, and I think also a version of that it is quite wider notion of health than only the physiological part. It's more of a well-being idea, with psychological and social factors involved in that.
And it feels like it's nice to hold on to some of that heritage, like it was a holistic thing.
Yeah, but the actual activities or movements, they're almost completely lost. We introduce them in PET for the students so they can see, and then they can go back, but they're not used in school anymore, other as historical curiosity around what we did 100 years ago.
And I guess I know your experience and your interaction with PE goes far more globally than Sweden. So can I ask, are there any aspects of PE curricula elsewhere around the world where you go, I really like that? If I was to cherry pick from across the world, what would you pick?
I've read some, but of course they're very, I think there are different systems of what policy does to practice in different countries. That's the first thing. So some countries' policy is stronger in terms of what is happening in practice. In some places, policy is just something you put on the shelf and then do whatever. So it's a different thing. But if you only look at the policy document, I think, well, what has happened in Australia over the last couple of years, when they introduced the national curriculum, when they look at health literacy, educative outcomes, strength-based health, and so forth, is an interesting formulation, particularly if you read the background documents, how they built it on research and how they built it on indigenous knowledges, certain views of health, certain views of education, critical thinking, which I think is really good. I'm not saying it always happening in practice, but it's really interesting, HB in Australia. Some of the Canadian ones, I think Ontario has some really nice formulation around policy. Not knowing, because I haven't done studies in Canada that much, but there are some interesting policies out there that is really helpful. And particularly looking at the background documents, not only looking at policy documents, what are thoughts behind it. And it was a really, because the Australian one I was part of discussing with some of the curriculum writers around stuff they did over the time. And we wrote a paper in 2013 around June McDonald, Louise McQuaig, and I, around how a certain view of health come into policy in a certain way, and what that can mean for practice.
Yeah. I've got a chat on Friday night with Dean Dudley, so I will dig a little bit deeper on the Australian bit with him then, no doubt. And then I guess the other bit that would be really fascinating to hear about is what, as we sit here today, what does PE and homeschooling look like? What are PE practitioners doing to try to cope in this crisis of COVID?
Yeah. Well, in Sweden, first, we have done things a little bit differently than most of the world in terms of what we have done. And the one thing we didn't do was close compulsory schooling. So we kept compulsory schooling has been ongoing all the time up to year 15. the argument in Sweden for that was that we didn't see as much spread through young people of the disease, and then also that most of these schools, they gather students locally anyway, and they meet in their spare time anyway, so it doesn't make that much of a difference. In upper secondary, however, it's more of a choice, and you choose schools, and pupils move over greater distances, that they meet in new groups. So that's why it was homeschooling from upper secondary. So if we look at up to year 9, they've been in school, of course. That has been some activities haven't been used, like some types of dance, couples dancing, of course. They have not done much gymnastics or swimming, avoided that, and stuff happening in environments where there are people. Fortunately, this happened during the spring, so it's been a lot of the outdoor activities. Right. So most of it is outdoors. You can do games, you can do the outdoor ed part of Friluftsliv parts. Yeah. So I think up to year 9, well, it's a little bit different than it would have been. I mean, you don't do tag games or other kind of games, but you can work it out. I mean, they can do it.
For example, is off.
No. Yeah. But it wouldn't have happened during the spring anyway, because doing outdoors, okay, they could have played football, but you can play football without really close contact, because they don't do tackling anyway when they do it in the school version of football or soccer. So, okay. So in that sense, I think it's the difference isn't huge for them. Of course, in upper secondary, which has been a distance, but then as they grow older, at least in Sweden, the subject becomes more theoretical, in a sense that they bring in more theory. It's more individual activities. It's more about planning activities or writing activity diaries and stuff like that. So, and of course, it's easier to have that kind of. My 2 daughters, they're twins, they're 16, so they have upper secondary, so they get do 3 different activities, write an activity diary, reflect on the activities in terms of psychological or physiological aspects of your activity, and send it in. They of course record more lectures around a certain topic, because part of that is also risk management. Lifting techniques is part of PE at that age. Ergonomics, like looking at how you sit, and of course they've used that. How do you sit when you work from home at the moment? What is your sitting position? What should you do for strength training or activities in order to not get shoulder pain or stuff like that? So they write stuff around different, because one part of is discussing different concepts of health and different views of health, and reflect around that. So they do that. So I think if it continues during the autumn, it would affect more than it has now in Sweden for PE, I would say.
They've been able to adapt, and actually perhaps some of the restraints of timetabled lessons and set homeworks, some of those shackles are off, and if the students are motivated to learn, they can actually apply and do more.
Yeah, and I follow they use Facebook groups quite a lot, teachers in Sweden, so I follow those and comment sometimes from a research perspective. But I've done this video of a dance we can use, which is, I mean, corona-friendly dance with distancing, but they're doing different kinds. This they can doing a follow, or we can do follow just dance on videos like that. So which is more individual. So they're quite creative. It's less around, since the kids up to 15, it's less around getting them to get a pulse up. It's learning things around this, because it's a short period of time, and it's mostly homeschooling for the older ones, and they can take more responsibility for their activities in that sense.
And you were talking about the activity diaries. Do they form a part of the coursework element? I presume, do all students do an examined course in PE?
Yeah, Well, I would say because part of the goals for upper secondary is around you should be able to plan, reflect upon from different perspectives of health, and try out activities and evaluate what you have done in relation to these aspects of health. And I mean, the activity diary is a way to do that. I mean, it's a way to teach that. But then, of course, it can be an activity diary only around the physiological part, but it can also be, they involve different aspects. Okay, reflect upon it from 3 different aspects of health or whatever. So it's a way to work. It's not written into the curriculum, but since from planning to evaluating and doing, then that kind of activity diary is quite good. They also, I put out some stuff on Facebook saying this could be a nice idea. We used an article where we looked at older women's strength training and health from a salutogenic perspective, and we had some interview questions around how we view health. So I put that out as an idea for upper secondary. Call an older relative, ask them questions about what is health for you, what do you do for health normally, when you're isolated, what is well-being and health for you now. So I see some schools use that as a prompt for them to do that, and then they write a sort of short essay around what they found. So those kind of things they pick up.
Yeah, and is there much flex in that? Is it because again in the UK we have, well, in England, sorry, the core PE curriculum is largely just doing. Whereas if students choose the examined pathway, so that's largely based on an exam at the end, but they'll also have their practical performance.
Mm-hmm.
So your twins, it sounds like they're getting into quite a bit of detail. Will they do an exam in PE?
Yeah. Well, it's the same. It's a core PE that's the same for all. So it's the same up till year 9 for everybody. When you come to upper secondary, it's 2 courses. One course usually is you can do it over 1 year, or usually they do it over the first 2 years, but you can also have a choice of having a second course the 3rd year, but that's a choice. But the core one is the same for everybody. So the planning and the reflecting and everything around that I've talked about is that everybody that chooses to go, and I mean it's about 96-97% that goes to upper secondary in Sweden, even if it's voluntary in one sense.
Yeah, so there's the majority of students that leave secondary education have had a pretty detailed and holistic and knowledge as well as skill. And that's really and then I guess the other bit for me is I feel like this moment of COVID, if I'm always the optimist, it's given us this chance to reset, and certainly in England, press pause and think, is what we're doing reflective of what we want to give all these people and what's really important and what matters? Again, you talk in your paper about your hope for PE. I'm just wondering if you've got anything that you hope may come of this, whether that be in Sweden or elsewhere.
Well, I think that during this time, and particularly in countries like in England, where everything is homeschooling, it's about coping with, let's do the best of the situation. That's one thing, of course. That's why we use different kinds of media outlets and stuff just to get people active, and I'm fine with that. I'm no problem with that at all. It's as long as we make it about P in a sense. But for me, as I wrote about in that paper, is we always have to start in the purpose of education, in the why, and that is important. This can force us, because when we don't see them every day and just do things with them, we have to reflect on, okay, why am I doing this? What is the purpose? Because the what and how comes after. It's so easy to, I mean, I talked about the pedagogical questions of why, how, and what. And I think it's the wrong way around to start in the what, going to the how, and then ending with the why. For example, you start in what, playing basketball, going on to how, well, we play with 2 goals. Yeah, exactly. And then the why. Well, why? Well, you learn sport, and you learn how to cooperate, you learn to be a good sport, and you learn character building. well, you should do the other. If we want to do character building and cooperation, define that first, and then, okay, what? Then the answer might not be basketball anymore. So we start in the wrong. And we are forced to do that when we're doing distance teaching. We are forced to start in the purpose a little bit. And I want to urge everybody to start in what is the educated purpose I want them to take along on their ride, on their growth to new things in their lives. Oh, this is it. Okay, what should I then do, and how should I do that? And then, of course, I'm not written about that as much in that paper, but there are always two whats: the what of teaching and the what of learning. I mean, what do I teach them, but what should they learn? It might not be the same thing, of course. It might be different things. And of course, how should I teach, and how should they learn this, what they should learn? So it's about, but always start in the why, the purpose of education. And I don't mind that we have different ideas what the purpose of education is. Is it to have more physical activity here and now, or is it lifelong perspective, or is it cooperation? But as long as we start in the why, then we can discuss that and have different opinions, but move on from that. So I hope this will force us to do more of the why question.
And the why question is the hard question, is it? It's the fuzzy stuff, and that's why
Yep.
Typically, not to stereotype all physical educators, but we're doers. We jump into the operational aspect of it and make it happen, rather than being really cognitive about it and thinking through why.
But I think for me, I think this is the good thing about PE teachers in many senses. They are caring. They have a genuine passion for what they're doing. They have, at least what I see in school, they have a genuine relation to a lot of pupils that other teachers don't have. They have a close connection because you do things embodied together, and you're there, you're caring for them. And that is the good stuff. Let's keep that. We should always keep that. But just start in, okay, I can have a why if I want to teach them rugby or cricket or basketball. But what if there are more important things in life that we can do with our bodies and embodied learning? Start with that. And then do all the good stuff that we the caring and the relations and the enthusiasm, and do it through movement in different ways. I'm totally fine with that. So let's keep the good. We shouldn't skip because sometimes I think when health was brought in more in the Swedish curriculum in 1994, it was a good intention, but the problem is that the teacher starting health became theory, and the idrott, the sport part, was the practice. That wasn't the intention. Yeah, so keep it together. Do the good things you already done. You don't have to do more within a classroom. You can do theory in practice. So it's more like do what you're good at, but start from another starting point, I would suggest.
And that's, you touched earlier on, that's a really interesting interchange between the practice and the policy, and which one is leading which.
Yeah. And for me, it's always a going back and forth. It's policy shouldn't be from upside down, and with the hope that it will happen in practice, because it never will. It's always a transformation between. I mean, we used that in a recent paper we're working on with Ash Casey. Actually, it's policy is between hope and happening, and the transformation from hope to happening is the interesting part, and that's where the teachers are at all the time. So that transformation part, but if we do that transformation without the educative elements or without the purpose of education, we lose something, I think.
Yeah. And I guess there's a lot to lose potentially when you're trying to balance so many pressures, requirements, perspectives of what it can or should be. Yeah. And I'm conscious we could talk on all night, but we're a busy man.
No worries.
I massively appreciate your time. So, Mikael, thank you so much for joining us. I'm
Yep,
sure
thanks.
you want to navigate back to this whole interview.